I tell this story not for my own honor, for there is little of that here, and not as a warning, for a man of my calling learns quickly that all warnings are in vain. Nor do I tell it in apology for St. Benedict's school, for St. Benedict's school needs no apologies. I tell it only to record certain foretellable incidents in the life of a well-known man, in the event that the brief candle of his days may sometime come under the scrutiny of another student of history. That is all. This is a story without surprises. There are those, in fact, who say I should have known what would happen between St. Benedict's and me, and I suppose they are right. But I loved that school. I gave service there to the minds of 3 generations of boys, and always left upon them, if I was successful, the delicate imprint of their culture. I battled their indolence with discipline, their boorishness with philosophy, and the arrogance of their stations with the history of great men before them. I taught the sons of 19 senators. I taught a boy who, if not for the vengeful recriminations of the tabloids, would today have been President of the United States. That school was my life. That is why, I suppose, I accepted the invitation sent to me by Mr. Sedgwick Bell at the end of last year, although I should have known better. I suppose I should have recalled what kind of boy he had been at St. Benedict's 41 years before, instead of posting my response so promptly in the mail and beginning that evening to prepare my test. He, of course, was the son of Senator Sedgwick Hiram Bell, the West Virginia demagogue who kept horses at his residence in Washington, D.C., and had swung several southern states for Wendell Willkie. The younger Sedgwick was a dull boy. I first met him when I had been teaching history at St. Benedict's for only 5 years, in the autumn after his father had been delivered to office on the shoulders of Southern patricians, frightened by the unionization of steel and mine workers. Sedgwick appeared in my classroom in November of 1945 in a short pants suit. It was midway through the fall term, that term in which I brought the boys forth from the philosophical idealism of the Greeks into the realm of commerce, military might, and the law, which had given Julius Caesar his prerogative from Macedonia to Seville. My students, of course, were agitated. It is a sad distinction of that age group, the exuberance with which the boys abandoned the moral endeavor of Plato and embraced the powerful, pragmatic hand of Augustus. The more sensitive ones had grown silent, and for several weeks our class discussions had been dominated by the martial instincts of the coarser boys. Of course, I was sorry for this, but I was well aware of the import of what I taught at St. Benedict's. Our headmaster, Mr. Woodbridge, made us continually aware of the role our students would eventually play in the affairs of our country. My classroom was, in fact, a tribute to the lofty ideals of man, which I hoped would inspire my boys, and at the same time to the fleeting nature of human accomplishment, which I hoped would temper their ambition with humility. It was a dual tactic, with which Mr. Woodbridge heartily agreed. Above the doorframe hung a tablet, made as a term project by Henry L. Stimson when he was a boy here, that I hoped would teach my students of the irony that history bestows upon ambition. In clay relief it said, "I am Shutruk Nahunte, king of Anshan and Susa, sovereign of the land of Elam. By the command of Inshushinek, I destroyed Sippar, took the steel of Naram-Sin, and brought it back to Elam, where I erected it as an offering to my god Inshushinek." Shutruk Nahunte, 1158 B.C. I always noted this tablet to the boys on their first day in my classroom, partly to inform them of their predecessors at St. Benedict's, and partly to remind them of the great ambition and conquest that had been utterly forgotten centuries before they were born. Afterward, I had one of them recite, from the wall where it hung above my desk, Shelley's Ozymandias. It is critical for any man of import to understand his own insignificance before the sands of time. And this is what my classroom always showed my boys. As young Sedgwick Bell stood in the doorway of that classroom his first day at St. Benedict's, however, it was apparent that such efforts would be lost on him. I could see that he was not only a dullard, but a roustabout. The boys happened to be wearing the togas they had made from sheets and safety pins the day before, spreading their knees like magistrates on the wooden desk chairs, and I was taking them through the recitation of the emperors when Mr. Woodbridge entered alongside the stout, red-faced Sedgwick, and introduced him to the class. I had taught for several years already, as I have said, and I knew the look of frightened, desperate bravura on a new boy's face. Cedric Bell did not wear this look. Rather, he wore one of disdain. The boys, 15 in all, were instantly intimidated into sensing the foolishness of their improvised cloaks, and one of them, Fred Masudi, the leader of the dullards, though far from a dullard himself, said, to mild laughter, "Where's your toga, kid?" Cedric Bell answered, "Your mother must be wearing your pants today." It took me a moment to regain the attention of the class, and when Cedric was seated, I had him go to the board and copy out the emperors. Of course he did not know the names of any of them, and my boys had to call them out, repeatedly correcting his spelling as he wrote out in a sloppy hand, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, Galba, Otho, all the while lifting and resettling the legs of his short pants in mockery of what his new classmates were wearing. "Young man," I said, "this is a serious class, and I expect that you will take it seriously." "If it's such a serious class, then why are they all wearing dresses?" he responded, again to laughter, although by now Fred Masudi had loosened the rope belt at his waist, and the boys around him were shifting uncomfortably in their togas. From that first day, Cedric Bell was a boor and a bully, a damper to the illumination of the eager minds of my boys, and a purveyor of the mean-spirited humor that is like kerosene in a school such as ours. What I asked of my boys that semester was simple, that they learn the facts I presented to them in an outline of ancient Roman history, which I had whittled through my years of teaching to exactly 4 closely typed pages. Yet Cedric Bell was unwilling to do so. He was a poor student, and on his first exam could not even tell me who it was that Mark Antony and Octavian had routed at Philippi, nor who Octavian later became, although an average wood beetle on the floor of my classroom could have done so with ease. Furthermore, as soon as he arrived, he began a stream of capers using spitballs, wads of gum, and thumbtacks. Of course, it was common for a new boy to engage his comrades thusly, but Cedric Bell then began to add the dangerous element of natural leadership, which was based on the physical strength of his features, to his otherwise puerile antics. He organized the boys. At exactly 15 minutes to the hour, they would all drop their pencils at once, or cough, or slap close to their books so that writing at the blackboard, my hands would jump in the air. At a boys' school, of course, punishment is a cultivated art. Whenever one of these antics occurred, I simply made a point of calling on Cedric Bell to answer a question. General laughter usually followed his stabs at answers, and although Cedric himself usually laughed along with everybody else, it did not require a great deal of insight to know that the tactic would work. The organized events began to occur less frequently. In retrospect, however, perhaps my strategy was a mistake, for to convince a boy of his own stupidity is to shoot a poisonous arrow indeed. Perhaps Cedric Bell's life would have turned out more nobly if I had understood his motivations right away and treated him differently at the start. But such are the pointless speculations of a teacher. What was irrefutably true was that he was performing poorly on his quizzes, even if his behavior had improved somewhat, and therefore I called him to my office. In those days, I lived in small quarters off the rear of the main hall, in what had been a slave's room when the ground of St. Benedict's had been the estate of the philanthropist and horse breeder Cyrus Beck. Having been at school as long as I had, I no longer lived in the first-form dormitory that stood behind my room, but supervised it, so that I saw most of the boys only in matters of urgency. They came sheepishly before me. With my bed folded into the wall, the room became my office, and shortly after supper one day that winter of his first-form year, Cedric Bell knocked and entered. Immediately he began to inspect the premises, casting his eyes, which had the patrician set of his father's, from the desk to the shelves to the bed folded into the wall. "Sit down, boy." "You're not married, are you, sir?" "No, Cedric, I am not. However, we are here to talk about you." "That's why you like putting us in togas, right?" Frankly, I had never encountered a boy like him before, who at the age of 13 would affront his schoolmaster without other boys in audience. He gazed at me flatly, his chin in his hand. "Young man," I said, sensing his motivations with sudden clarity. "We are concerned about your performance here, and I have made an appointment to see your father." In fact, I had made no appointment with Senator Bell, but at that moment, I understood that I would have to. "What would you like me to tell the senator?" I said. His gaze faltered. "I'm going to try harder, sir, from now on." "Good, Sedgwick, good." Indeed, that week the boys reenacted the pivotal scenes from Julius Caesar, and Sedgwick read his lines quite passably and contributed little that I could see to the occasional fits of giggles that circulated among the slower boys. The next week, I gave a quiz on the triumvirate of Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar, and he passed for the first time yet with a C+. Nonetheless, I had told him that I was going to speak with his father, and this is what I was determined to do. At the time, Senator Sedgwick Hiram Bell was appearing regularly in the newspapers and on the radio in his stand against Truman's plan for national health insurance, and I was loath to call upon such a well-known man concerning the behavior of his son. On the radio, his voice was a tobacco drawl that had won him populist appeal throughout West Virginia, although his policies alone would certainly not have done so. I was, at the time, in my late 20s, and although I was armed with scruples and an education, my hands trembled as I dialed his office. To my surprise, I was put through, and the senator, in the drawl I recognized instantly, agreed to meet me one afternoon the following week. The man already enjoyed national stature, of course, and although any other father would no doubt have made the journey to St. Benedict's himself, I admit that the prospect of seeing the man in his own office intrigued me. Thus I journeyed to the capital. St. Benedict's lies in the bucolic equine expanse of rural Virginia, nearer in spirit to the Carolinas than to Maryland, although the drive to Washington requires little more than an hour. The bus followed the misty serpentine course of the Passaic, then entered the marshlands that are now the false brick suburbs of Washington, and at last left me downtown in the capital, where I proceeded the rest of the way on foot. I arrived at the Senate office building as the sun moved low against the bare-limbed cherries among the grounds. I was frightened but determined, and I reminded myself that Sedgwick Hiram Bell was a senator, but also a father, and I was there on business that concerned his son. The office was as grand as a duke's. I had not waited long in the anteroom when the man himself appeared, feisty as a game hen, bursting through a side door and clapping me on the shoulder as he urged me before him into his office. Of course, I was a novice then in the world of politics, and had not yet realized that such men are, above all, likable. He put me in a leather seat, offered me a cigar, which I refused, and then with real or contrived wonder, perhaps he did something like this with all of his visitors, he proceeded to show me an antique sidearm that had been sent to him that morning by a constituent, and that had once belonged, he said, to the coachman of Robert E. Lee. "You're a history buff," he said, "right?" "Yes, sir." "Well, then take it. It's yours." "No, sir, I couldn't." "Take the damn thing." "All right, I will." "Now, what brings you to this dreary little office?" "Your son, sir." "What the devil has he done now?" "Very little, sir. We are concerned that he isn't learning the material." "What material's that?" "We're studying the Romans now, sir. We've left the Republic and entered the Empire." "Ah," he said. "Be careful with that, by the way, it still fires." "Your son seems not to be paying attention, sir." He again offered me the box of cigars across the desk, and then bit off the end of his own. "Tell me," he said, puffing the thing until it flamed suddenly, "what's the good of what you're teaching them boys?" This was a question for which I was well prepared, fortunately, having recently written a short piece in the St. Benedict's Crier answering the same challenge put forth there by an anonymous boy. "When they read of the reign of Augustus Caesar," I said without hesitation, "when they learn that his rule was bolstered by commerce, a postal system, and the arts, by the reformation of the Senate, and by the righting of an inequitable system of taxation, when they see the effect of scientific progress through the census and the enviable network of Roman roads, how these advances led mankind away from the brutish rivalries of potentates into the 2 centuries of Pax Romana, then they understand the importance of character and high ideals." He puffed at his cigar. Now that's a horse who can talk, he said. And you're telling me my son Sedgwick has his head in the clouds. It's my job, sir, to mold your son's character. He thought for a moment, idly fingering a match. Then his look turned stern. I'm sorry, young man, he said slowly, but you will not mold him. I will mold him. You will merely teach him. That was the end of my interview, and I was politely shown the door. I was bewildered, naturally, and found myself in the elevator before I could even take account of what had happened. Senator Bell was quite likable, as I have noted, but he had without doubt cut me, and as I made my way back to the bus station, the gun stowed deep in my briefcase, I considered what it must have been like to have been raised under such a tyrant. My heart warmed somewhat toward young Sedgwick. Back at St. Benedict's, furthermore, I saw that my words had evidently had some effect on the boy, for in the weeks that followed, he continued on his struggling uphill course. He passed 2 more quizzes, receiving an A- on one of them. For his midterm project, he produced an adequate papier-mâché rendering of Hadrian's Gate, and in class he was less disruptive to the group of do-nothings among whom he sat, if indeed he was not in fact attentive. Such, of course, are the honeyed morsels of a teacher's existence, those students who come under one's own direction from the darkness to the light, and I admit that I might have taken a special interest that term in Sedgwick Bell. If I gave him the benefit of the doubt on his quizzes when he straddled 2 grades, if I began to call on him in class only for those questions I had reason to believe he could answer, then I was merely trying to encourage the nascent curiosity of a boy who, to all appearances, was struggling gamely from beneath the formidable umbra of his father. The fall term was by then drawing to a close, and the boys had begun the frenzy of preliminary quizzes for the annual Mr. Julius Caesar competition. Here again, I suppose I was in my own way rooting for Sedgwick. Mr. Julius Caesar is a St. Benedict's tradition, held in reverence among the boys, the kind of mythic ritual that is the currency of a school like ours. It is a contest held in 2 phases. The first is a narrowing maneuver, by means of a dozen written quizzes, from which 3 boys from the first form emerge victorious. The second is a public tournament, in which these 3 take the stage before the assembled student body and answer questions about ancient Rome until one alone emerges triumphant, as had Caesar himself from among Crassus and Pompey. Parents and graduates fill out the audience. In front of Mr. Woodbridge's office, a plaque attests to the Mr. Julius Caesars of the previous half-century, a list that begins with John F. Dulles in 1901. And although the ritual might seem quaint to those who have not attended St. Benedict's, I can only say that in a school like ours, one cannot overstate the importance of a public joust. That year, I had 3 obvious contenders. Fred Masudi, who, as I intimated, is a somewhat gifted boy, Martin Blythe, a studious type, and Deepak Mehta, the son of a Bombay mathematician, who was dreadfully quiet, but clearly my best student. It was Deepak, in fact, who on his own and entirely separate from the class had studied the disparate peoples, from the Carthaginians to the Egyptians, whom the Romans had conquered. By the end of the narrowing quizzes, however, a surprising configuration had emerged. Sedgwick Bell had pulled himself to within a few points of 3rd place in my class. This was when I made my first mistake. Although I should certainly have known better, I was impressed enough by his efforts that I broke one of the cardinal rules of teaching. I gave him an A on a quiz on which he had earned only a B, and in so doing, I leapfrogged him over Martin Blythe. On the 15th of March, when the 3 finalists took their seats on stage in front of the assembled population of the school, Sedgwick Bell was among them, and his father was among the audience. The 3 boys had donned their togas for the event, and were arranged around the dais, on which a pewter platter held the green silk garland that, at the end of the morning, I would place upon the brow of the winner. As the interrogator, I stood front row center, next to Mr. Woodbridge. "Which language was spoken by the Sabines?" "Oscan," answered Fred Masudi without hesitation. "Who composed the second triumvirate?" "Mark Antony, Octavian, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, sir," answered Deepak Mehta. Who was routed at Philippi? Cedric Bell's eyes showed no recognition. He lowered his head in his hands, as though pushing himself to the limit of his intellect, and in the front row my heart dropped. Several boys in the audience began to twitter. Cedric's leg began to shake inside his toga. When he looked up again, I felt that it was I who had put him in this untenable position. I who had brought a tender bud too soon into the heat, and I wondered if he would ever forgive me. But then, without warning, he smiled slightly, folded his hands, and said, Brutus and Cassius. Good, I said instinctively. Then I gathered my poise. Who deposed Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor of the Western Empire? Odoacer, Fred Masudi answered, then added, in 476 A.D. Who introduced the professional army to Rome? Gaius Marius, sir, answered Deepak Mehta, then himself added, in 104 B.C. When I asked Sedgwick his next question, who was the leading Carthaginian general of the Second Punic War, I felt some unease, because the boys in the audience seemed to sense that I was favoring him with an easier examination. Nonetheless, his head sank into his hands, and he appeared once again to be straining the limits of his memory before he looked up and produced the obvious answer. Hannibal. I was delighted. Not only was he proving my gamble worthwhile, but he was showing the twittering boys in the audience that, under fire, discipline produces accurate thought. By now they had quieted, and I had the sudden, heartening premonition that Cedric Bell was going to surprise us after all, that his tortoise-like deliberation would win him by morning's end the garland of laurel. The next several rounds of questions proceeded much in the same manner as had the previous two. Deepak Mehta and Fred Masudi answered without hesitation, and Cedric Bell did so only after a tedious and deliberate period of thought. What I realized, in fact, was that his style made for excellent theater. The parents, I could see, were impressed, and Mr. Woodbridge next to me, no doubt thinking about the next annual fund drive, was smiling broadly. After a second form boy had brought a glass of water to each of the contestants, I moved on to the next level of questions. These had been chosen for their difficulty, and on the first round, Fred Masudi fell out, not knowing the names of Augustus's children. He left the stage and moved back among his dim-witted pals in the audience. By the rule of clockwise progression, the same question then went to Deepak Mehta, who answered it correctly, followed by the next one, which concerned King Jugurtha of Numidia. Then, because I had no choice, I had to ask Cedric Bell something difficult. Which general had the support of the aristocrats in the Civil War of 88 B.C.? To the side, I could see several parents pursing their lips and furrowing their brows, but Cedric Bell appeared to not even notice the greater difficulty of the query. Again he dropped his head into his hands. By now the audience expected his period of deliberation, and they sat quietly. One could hear the hum of the ventilation system and the dripping of the icicles outside. Cedric Bell cast his eyes downward, and it was at this moment that I realized he was cheating. I had come to this job straight from my degree at Carleton College at the age of 21, having missed enlistment due to myopia, and carrying with me the hope that I could give to my boys the more important vision that my classical studies had given to me. I knew that they responded best to challenge. I knew that a teacher who coddled them at that age would only hold them back, would keep them in the bosoms of their mothers so long that they would remain weak-minded through preparatory school and inevitably then through college. The best of my own teachers had been tyrants. I well remembered this. Yet, at that moment, I felt an inexplicable pity for the boy. Was it simply the humiliation we had both suffered at the hands of his father? I peered through my glasses at the stage and knew at once he had attached the outline of ancient Roman history to the inside of his toga. I don't know how long I stood there, between the school assembled behind me and the two boys seated in front. But after a period of internal deliberation, during which time I could hear the rising murmurs of the audience, I decided that in the long run, it was best for Sedgwick Bell to be caught. Oh, how the battle is lost for want of a horse! I leaned to Mr. Woodbridge next to me and whispered, "I believe Sedgwick Bell is cheating." "Ignore it," he whispered back. "What?" Of course, I have great respect for what Mr. Woodbridge did for St. Benedict's in the years he was among us. A headmaster's world is a far more complex one than a teacher's, and it is historically inopportune to blame a life gone afoul on a single incident in childhood. However, I myself would have stood up for our principles had Mr. Woodbridge not at that point said, "Ignore it, Hundert, or look for another job." Naturally, my headmaster's words startled me for a moment. But being familiar with the necessities of a boys' school, and having recently entertained my first thoughts about one day becoming a headmaster myself, I simply nodded when Sedgwick Bell produced the correct answer: Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Then I went on to the next question, which concerned Scipio Africanus Major. Deepak Mehta answered it correctly, and I turned once again to Sedgwick Bell. In a position of moral leadership, of course, compromise begets only more compromise. And although I know this now from my own experience, at the time I did so only from my study of history. Perhaps that is why I again found an untenable compassion muddying my thoughts. What kind of desperation would lead a boy to cheat on a public stage? His father and mother were well back in the crowded theater, but when I glanced behind me, my eye went instantly to them, as though they were indeed my own parents out from Kansas City. "Who were the first emperors to reign over the divided empire?" I asked Sedgwick Bell. When one knows the magician's trick, the only wonder is in its obviousness. And as Sedgwick Bell lowered his head this time, I clearly saw the nervous flutter of his gaze directed into the toga. Indeed, I imagined him scanning the entire outline, from Augustus to Jovian, pasted inside the twill, before coming to the answer, which, pretending to ponder, he then spoke aloud. "Valentinian the First and Valens." Suddenly, Senator Bell called out, "That's my boy!" The crowd thundered, and I had the sudden, indefensible urge to steer the contest in young Sedgwick Bell's direction. In a few moments, however, from within the subsiding din, I heard the thin, accented voice of a woman speaking Deepak Mehta's name. And it was the presence of his mother, I suppose, that finally brought me to my senses. Deepak answered the next question about Diocletian correctly, and then I turned to Sedgwick Bell and asked him, "Who was Hamilcar Barca?" Of course, it was only Deepak who knew that this answer was not in the outline, because Hamilcar Barca was a Phoenician general eventually routed by the Romans. It was only Deepak, as I have noted, who had bothered to study the conquered peoples. He briefly widened his eyes at me, in recognition, in gratitude, in disapproval, while beside him, Sedgwick Bell again lowered his head into his hands. After a long pause, Sedgwick asked me to repeat the question. I did so, and after another long pause, he scratched his head. Finally, he said, "Geez." The boys in the audience laughed, but I turned and silenced them. Then I put the same question to Deepak Mehta, who answered it correctly, of course, and then received a round of applause which was polite, but not sustained. It was only as I mounted the stage to present Deepak with the garland of laurel, however, that I glanced at Mr. Woodbridge and realized that he, too, had wanted me to steer the contest toward Sedgwick Bell. At the same moment, I saw Senator Bell making his way toward the rear door of the hall. Young Sedgwick stood limply to the side of me, and I believe I had my first inkling then of the mighty forces that would twist the life of that boy. I could only imagine his thoughts as he stood there on stage, while his mother, struggling to catch up with the senator, vanished through the fire door at the back. By the next morning, our calligraphers would add Deepak Mehta's name to the plaque outside Mr. Woodbridge's office, and young Sedgwick Bell would begin his lifelong pursuit of missed glory. Yet, perhaps because of the disappointment I could see in Mr. Woodbridge's eyes. It somehow seemed that I was the one who had failed the boy, and as soon as the auditorium was empty, I left for his room. There I found him seated on the bed, still in his toga, gazing out the small window to the lacrosse fields. I could see the sheets of my outline pressed against the inside of his garment. "Well, young man," I said, knocking on the door frame, "that certainly was an interesting performance." He turned around from the window and looked at me coldly. What he did next, I have thought about many times over the years, the labyrinthine wiliness of it, and I can only attribute the precociousness of his maneuvering to the bitter education he must have received at home. As I stood before him in the doorway, Cedric Bell reached inside his cloak and one at a time lifted out the pages of my outline. I stepped inside and closed the door. Every teacher knows a score of boys who do their best to be expelled. This is a cliché in a school like ours. But as soon as I closed the door to his room and he acknowledged the act with a feline smile, I knew that this was not Cedric Bell's intention at all. "I knew you saw," he said. "Yes, you are correct." "How come you didn't say anything, Mr. Hundred?" "It's a complicated matter, Sedgwick." "It's because my pop was there." "It had nothing to do with your father." "Sure, Mr. Hundred." Frankly, I was at my wits' end, first from what Mr. Woodbridge had said to me in the theater, and now from the audacity of the boy's accusation. I myself went to the window then and let my eyes wander over the campus so that they would not have to engage the dark, accusatory gaze of Cedric Bell. What transpires in an act of omission like the one I had committed? I do not blame Mr. Woodbridge, of course, any more than a soldier can blame his captain. What had happened was that instead of enforcing my own code of morals, I had allowed Cedric Bell to sweep me summarily into his. I did not know at the time what an act of corruption I had committed, although what is especially chilling to me is that I believe that Cedric Bell, even at the age of 13, did. He knew also, of course, that I would not pursue the matter. Although I spent the ensuing several days contemplating a disciplinary action, each time I summoned my resolve to submit the boy's name to the honor committee, however, my conviction waned. For at these times I seemed to myself to be nothing more than one criminal turning in another. I fought this battle constantly, in my simple rooms, at the long chipped table I governed in the dining hall, and at the dusty chalkboard before my classes. I felt like an exhausted swimmer, trying to climb a slippery wall out of the sea. Furthermore, I was alone in my predicament, for among a boarding school faculty, which is as perilous as a medieval court, one does not publicly discuss a boy's misdeeds. This is true even if the boy is not the son of a senator. In fact, the only teacher I decided to trust with my situation was Charles Ellerby, our new Latin instructor and a kindred lover of antiquity. I had liked Charles Ellerby as soon as we had met, because he was a moralist of no uncertain terms. And indeed, when I confided in him about Cedric Bell's behavior and Mr. Woodbridge's response, he suggested that it was my duty to circumvent our headmaster and speak directly to the boy's father. Of course, this made sense to me, even if I knew it would be difficult to do. I decided to speak to Senator Bell again. Less than a week after I had begun to marshal my resolve, however, the senator himself called me. He proffered a few moments of small talk, asked again after the gun he had given me, and then said gruffly, "Young man, my son tells me that the Hannibal Barca question was not on the list he had to know." Now, indeed, I was shocked. Even from Cedric Bell, I had not expected this audacity. "How deeply the viper is a viper," I said, before I could help myself. "Excuse me?" "The Phoenician general was Hamilcar Barca, sir, not Hannibal." The senator paused. "My son tells me you asked him a question that was not on the list, which the Oriental fellow knew the answer to in advance. He feels you've been unfair, is all." "It's a complex situation, sir," I said. I marshaled my will again by imagining what Charles Ellerby would do in the situation. However, No sooner had I resolved to confront the senator than it became perfectly clear to me that I lacked the character to do so. I believe this had long been clear to Sedgwick Bell. "I'm sure it is complex," Senator Bell said. "But I assure you there are situations more complex. Now, I'm not asking you to correct anything this time, you understand. My son has told me a great deal about you, Mr. Hundert. If I were you, I'd remember that." "Yes, sir," I said, although by then I realized he had hung up. And thus young Sedgwick Bell and I began an uneasy compact that lasted out his days at St. Benedict's. He was a dismal student from that day forward, scratching at the very bottom of a class that was itself a far cry from the glorious yesteryear classes of John Dulles and Henry Stimson. His quizzes were abominations, and his essays were pathetic digestions of those of the boys sitting next to him. He chatted amiably in study hall, smoked cigarettes in the third form linen room, and when called upon in class could be counted on to blink and stutter as if called upon from sleep. But perhaps the glory days of St. Benedict's had already begun their wane, for even then, well before the large problems that beset us, no action was taken against the boy. For Charles Ellerby and me, he became a symbol, evidence of the first tendrils of moral rot that seemed to be twining among the posts and timbers of our school. Although we told nobody else of his secret, the boy's dim-witted recalcitrance soon succeeded in alienating all but the other students. His second and third form years passed as ingloriously as his first, and by the outset of his last with us, he had grown to mythic infamy among the faculty members who had known the school in its days of glory. He had grown physically larger as well, and now when I chanced upon him on the campus, he held his ground against my disapproving stare with a dark one of his own. To complicate matters, he had cultivated, despite his boorish character, an impressive popularity among his schoolmates, and it was only through the subtle intervention of several of his teachers that he had failed on 2 occasions to win the presidency of the student body. His stride had become a strut. His favor among the other boys, of course, had its origin in the strength of his physical features, in the precocious evil of his manner, and in the bellowing timbre of his voice. But unfortunately, such crudities are all the more impressive to a group of boys living out of sight of their parents. That is not to say that the faculty of St. Benedict's had given up hope for Sedgwick Bell. Indeed, a teacher's career is punctuated with difficult students like him, and despite the odds, one could not help but root for his eventual rehabilitation. As did all the other teachers, I held out hope for Sedgwick Bell. In his fits of depravity and intellectual feebleness, I continued to look for glimpses of discipline and progress. By his 4th form year, however, when I had become the dean of seniors, it was clear that Sedgwick Bell would not change. At least, not while he was at St. Benedict's. Despite his powerful station, he had not even managed to gain admission to the state university. It was with a sense of failure, then, finally, that I handed him his diploma in the spring of 1949, on an erected stage at the north end of the great field, on which he came forward, met my disapproving gaze with his own flat one, and trundled off to sit among his friends. It came as a surprise, then, when I learned in the Richmond Gazette 37 years later of Sedgwick Bell's ascension to the chairmanship of East America Steel, at that time the 2nd largest corporation in America. I chanced upon the news one morning in the winter of 1987, the year of my great problems with St. Benedict's, while reading the newspaper in the east-lighted breakfast room of the assistant headmaster's house. St. Benedict's, as everyone knows, had fallen upon difficult times by then, and an unseemly aspect of my job was that I had to maintain a lookout for possible donors to the school. Forthwith, I sent a letter to Sedgwick Bell. Apart from the 5 or 6 years in which a classmate had written to the Benedictine of his whereabouts, I had heard almost nothing about the boy since the year of his graduation. This was unusual, of course, as St. Benedict's makes a point of keeping abreast of its graduates, and I can only assume that his absence in the yearly alumni notes was due to an act of will on his own part. one wonders how much of the boy remained in the man. It is indeed a rare vantage that a St. Benedict's teacher holds, to have known our statesmen, our policy-makers, and our captains of industry in their days of short pants and classroom pranks, and I admit that it was with some nostalgia that I composed the letter. Since his graduation, of course, my career had proceeded with the steady ascension that the great schools have always afforded their dedicated teachers. 10 years after Sedgwick Bell's departure, I had moved from Dean of Seniors to Dean of the Upper School, and after a decade there to Dean of Academics, a post that some would consider a demotion, but that I seized with reverence, because it afforded me the chance to make inroads in the minds of a generation. At the time, of course, the country was in the throes of a violent peristaltic rejection of tradition, and I felt a particular urgency to my mission of staying a course that had led a century of boys through the rise and fall of ancient civilizations. In those days, our meetings of the faculty and trustees were rancorous affairs, in which great pressure was exerted in attempts to alter the time-tested curriculum of the school. Planning a course was like going into battle, and hiring a new teacher was like crowning a king. Whenever one of our ranks retired or left for another school, the different factions fought tooth and nail to influence the appointment. I was the Dean of Academics, as I have noted, and these skirmishes naturally were waged around my foxhole. For the lesser appointments, I often feinted to gather leverage for the greater ones, whose campaigns I fought with abandon. At one point especially, midway through that decade in which our country had lost its way, St. Benedict's arrived at a crossroads. The chair of humanities had retired, and a pitched battle over his replacement developed between Charles Ellerby and a candidate from the outside. A meeting ensued in which my friend and this other man spoke to the assembled faculty and trustees, and though I will not go into detail, I will say that the outside candidate felt that, because of the advances in our society, history had become little more than a relic. Oh, what dim-sighted times those were! The two camps sat on opposite sides of the chapel as speakers took to the podium one after another to wage war. The controversy quickly became a forum concerning the relevance of the past. Teacher after teacher debated the import of what we in history had taught for generations, and assertion after assertion was met with boos and applause. Tempers blazed. One powerful member of the board had come to the meeting in blue jeans and tie-dyed shirt. And after we had been arguing for several hours, and all of us were exhausted, he took the podium and challenged me personally, right then and there, to debate with him the merits of Roman history. He was not an ineloquent man, and he chose to speak his plea first, so that by the time he had finished his attack against antiquity, I sensed that my battle on behalf of Charles Ellerby and of history itself was near to lost. My heart was gravely burdened, for if we could not win our point here among teachers, then among whom indeed could we win it? The room was silent, and on the other side of the chapel our opponents were gathering nearer to one another in the pews. When I rose to defend my calling, however, I also sensed that victory was not beyond my reach. I am not a particularly eloquent orator, but as I took my place at the chapel rail in the amber glow of the small rose window above us, I was braced by the sudden conviction that the great men of history had sent me forward to preserve their deeds. Charles Ellerby looked up at me, biting his lip, and suddenly I remembered the answer I had written long ago in the crier. Its words flowed as though unbidden from my tongue, and when I had finished, I knew that we had won. It was my proudest moment at St. Benedict's. Although the resultant split among the faculty was an egregious one, Charles Ellerby secured the appointment, and together we were able to do what I had always dreamed of doing. We redoubled our commitment to classical education. In times of upheaval, of course, adherence to tradition is all the more important, and perhaps this was why St. Benedict's was brought intact through that decade and the one that followed. Our fortunes lifted and dipped with the gentle rhythm to which I had long ago grown accustomed. Our boys won sporting events and prizes, endured minor scandals and occasional tragedies, and then passed on to good colleges. Our endowment rose when the government was in the hand of the Republicans, as did the caliber of our boys when it was in the hands of the Democrats. Senator Bell declined from prominence, and within a few years I read that he had passed away. In time, I was made assistant headmaster. Indeed, it was not until a few years ago that anything out of the ordinary happened at all, for it was then, in the late 1980s, that some ill-advised investments were made, and our endowment suffered a decline. Mr. Woodbridge had by this time reached the age of 74, and although he was a vigorous man, one Sunday morning in May, while the school waited for him in the chapel, he died, open-eyed in his bed. Immediately, there occurred a Byzantine struggle for succession. There is nothing wrong about admitting that by then I myself coveted the job of headmaster, for one does not remain 5 decades at a school without becoming deeply attached to its fate. But Mr. Woodbridge's death had come suddenly, and I had not yet begun the preparations for my bid. I was, of course, no longer a young man. I suppose, in fact, that I had lost my advantage here by underestimating my opponents, who indeed were younger, as Caesar had done with Brutus and Cassius. I should not have been surprised, then, when after several days of maneuvering, my principal rival turned out to be Charles Ellerby. For several years, I discovered, he had been conducting his own internecine campaign for the position, and although I had always counted him as my ally and my friend, in the first meeting of the board, he rose and spoke accusations against me. He said that I was too old, that I had failed to change with the times, and that my method of pedagogy might have been relevant 40 years ago, but that it was not today. He stood and said that a headmaster needed vigor, and that I did not have it. Although I watched him the entire time he spoke, he did not once look back at me. I was wounded, of course, both professionally and in the hidden part of my heart, in which I had always counted Charles Ellerby as a companion in my lifelong search for the magnificence of the past. When several of the older teachers booed him, I felt cheered. At this point I saw that I was not alone in my bid, merely behind, and so I left the meeting without coming to my own defense. Evening had come, and I walked to the dining commons in the company of allies. How it is, when fighting for one's life, to eat among children! As the boys in their school blazers passed around the platters of fish sticks and the bowls of sliced bread, my heart was pierced with their guileless grace. How soon, I wondered, would they see the truth of the world? How long before they would understand that it was not dates and names that I had always meant to teach them? Not one of them seemed to notice what had descended like thunderheads above their faculty. Not one of them seemed unable to eat. After dinner, I returned to the assistant headmaster's house in order to plot my course and confer with those I still considered allies. But before I could begin my preparations, there was a knock at the door. Charles Ellerby stood there, red in the cheeks. "May I ask you some questions?" he said breathlessly. "It is I who ought to ask them of you," was my answer. He came in without being asked and took a seat at my table. "You've never been married, am I correct, Hundert?" "Look, Ellerby, I've been at St. Benedict's since you were in prep school yourself." Yes, he said, in exaggeration of boredom. Of course, he knew as well as I that I had never married, nor started a family, because history itself had always been enough for me. He rubbed his head and appeared to be thinking. To this day, I wonder how he knew about what he said next, unless Sedgwick Bell had somehow told him the story of my visit to the senator. "Look," he said, "there's a rumor that you keep a pistol in your desk drawer." "Hogwash." "Will you open it for me?" he said, pointing there. "No, I will not. I have been a dean here for 20 years. Are you telling me there is no pistol in this house?" He then attempted to stare me down. We had known each other for the good part of both of our lives, however, and the bid withered. At that point, in fact, as his eyes fell in submission to my determined gaze, I believe the headmastership became mine. It is a largely unexplored element of history, of course, and one that has long fascinated me. that a great deal of political power, and thus a great deal of the arc of nations, arises not from intellectual advancements nor social imperatives, but from the simple battle of wills among men at tables, just as had just occurred between Charles Ellerby and me. Instead of opening the desk and brandishing the weapon, however, which of course meant nothing to me, but no doubt would have seized the initiative from Ellerby, I denied to him its existence. Why, I do not know, for I was a teacher of history, and was not the firearm its greatest engine? Ellerby, on the other hand, was simply a gadfly to the passing morals of the time. He gathered his things and left my house. That evening I took the pistol from my drawer. A margin of rust had appeared along the filigreed handle, and despite the ornate workmanship, I saw clearly now that in its essence the weapon was ill-proportioned and blunt, the crude instrument of a violent, historically meager man. I had not even wanted it when the irascible demagogue Bell had foisted it upon me, and I had only taken it out of some vague sentiment that a pistol might eventually prove decisive. I suppose I had always imagined firing it some day in a moment of drama. Yet, now here it stood before me in a moment of torpor. I turned it over and cursed it. That night I took it from the drawer again, hid it in the pocket of my overcoat, and walked to the far end of the campus, where I crossed the marsh a good mile from my house, removed my shoes, and stepped into the babbling shallows of the Passaic. "The die is cast," I said, and I threw it 20 yards out into the water. The last impediment to my headmastership had been hurdled, and by the time I came ashore, walked back whistling to my front door, and changed for bed, I was ecstatic. Yet that night I slept poorly, and in the morning, when I rose and went to our faculty meeting, I felt that the mantle of my fortitude had slipped somehow from my shoulders. How hushed is demise! In the hall outside the faculty room, most of the teachers filed by without speaking to me, and once inside I became obsessed with the idea that I had missed this most basic lesson of the past, that conviction is the alpha and the omega of authority. Now I see that I was doomed the moment I threw that pistol in the water, for that is when I lost my conviction. It was as though Sedgwick Bell had risen all these years later to drag me down again. Indeed, once the meeting had begun, the older faculty members shrunk back from their previous support of my bid, and the younger ones encircled me, as though I were a limping animal. There might as well have been a dagger among the cloaks. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Charles Ellerby, a fellow antiquarian whose job I had once helped secure, had been named headmaster, and by the end of that month he had asked me to retire. And so I was preparing to end my days at St. Benedict's when I received Sedgwick Bell's response to my letter. It was well written, which I noted with pleasure, and contained no trace of rancor, which is what every teacher hopes to see in the maturation of his disagreeable students. In closing, he asked me to call him at East America Steel, and I did so that afternoon. When I gave my name first to one secretary and then to a second, and after that, moments later, heard Sedgwick's artfully guileless greeting, I instantly recalled speaking to his father some 40 years before. After small talk, including my condolences about his father, he told me that the reason he had replied to my letter was that he had often dreamed of holding a rematch of Mr. Julius Caesar, and that he was now willing to donate a large sum of money to St. Benedict's if I would agree to administer the event. Naturally, I assumed he was joking and passed off the idea with a comment about how funny it was, but Sedgwick Bell repeated the invitation. He wanted very much to be on stage again with Deepak Mehta and Fred Masudi. I suppose I should not have been surprised, for it is precisely this sort of childhood slight that will drive a great figure. I told him that I was about to retire. He expressed sympathy, but then suggested that the arrangement could be ideal, as now I would no doubt have time to prepare. Then he said that at this station in his life he could afford whatever he wanted materially, with all that this implied, of course, concerning his donation to the annual fund, but that more than anything else he desired the chance to reclaim his intellectual honor. I suppose I was flattered. Of course, he also offered a good sum of money to me personally. Although I had until then led a life in which finances were never more than a distant concern, I was keenly aware that my time in the school's houses and dining halls was coming to an end. On the one hand, it was not my burning aspiration to secure an endowment for the reign of Charles Ellerby. On the other hand, I needed the money, and I felt a deep loyalty to the school regarding the annual fund. That evening, I began to prepare my test. As assistant headmaster, I had not taught my beloved Roman history in many years, so that poring through my reams of notes was like returning at last to my childhood home. I stopped here and there among the files. I reread the term paper of young Derek Bach entitled The Search of Diogenes, and the scrawled one of James Watson called Archimedes' Method. Among the art projects, I found John Updike's reproduction of the obelisk of Cleopatra and a charcoal drawing of the Baths of Caracalla by the abstract expressionist Robert Motherwell, unfortunately torn in two and no longer worth anything. I had always been a diligent note-taker, furthermore, and I believed that what I came up with was a surprisingly accurate reproduction of the subjects on which I had once quizzed Fred Masudi, Deepak Mehta, and Cedric Bell nearly half a century before. It took me only 2 evenings to gather enough material for the task, although, in order not to appear eager, I waited several days before sending off another letter to Cedric Bell. He called me soon after. It is indeed a surprise to one who toils for his own keep to see the formidable strokes with which our captains of industry demolish the tasks before them. The morning after talking to Cedric Bell, I received calls from 2 of his secretaries, a social assistant, and a woman at a New York travel agency, who confirmed the arrangements for late July, 2 months hence. The event was to take place on an island off the outer banks of Carolina that belonged to East America Steel, and I sent along a list from the St. Benedict's archives so that everyone in Cedric Bell's class would be invited. I was not prepared, however, for the days of retirement that intervened. What little remained of that school year passed speedily in my preoccupation, and before I knew it, the boys were taking their final exams. I tried not to think about my future. At the commencement exercises in June, a small section of the ceremony was spent in my honor, but it was presided over by Charles Ellerby, and gave rise to a taste of copper in my throat. "And thus we bid adieu," he began, "to our beloved Mr. Hundert." He gazed out over the lectern, extended his arm in my direction, and proceeded to give a nostalgic rendering of my years at the school to the audience of jacketed businessmen, parasoled ladies, students in St. Benedict's blazers, and children in church suits, who, like me, were squirming at the meretriciousness of the man. Yet how quickly it was over! Awards were presented, "Hail, Fair Benedicts" was sung, and as the birches began to lean their narrow shadows against the distant edge of the marsh, the seniors came forward to receive their diplomas. The mothers wept, the alumni stood misty-eyed, and the graduates threw their hats into the air. Afterward, everyone dispersed for the headmaster's reception. I wish now that I had made an appearance there, for to have missed it, the very last one of my career, was a far more grievous blow to me than to Charles Ellerby. Furthermore, the handful of senior boys, who over their tenure had been pierced by the bee sting of history, no doubt missed my presence, or at least wondered at its lack. I spent the remainder of the afternoon in my house, and the evening walking out along the marsh, where the smell of wood smoke from a farmer's bonfire and the distant sounds of the gathered celebrants filled me with the great, sad pride of teaching. My boys were passing once again into the world without me. The next day, of course, parents began arriving to claim their children. Jitney buses ferried students to airports and train stations. The groundsman went around pulling up lacrosse goals and baseball bleachers, hauling the long black sprinkler hoses behind his tractor into the fields. I spent most of that day and the next one sitting at the desk in my study, watching through the window as the school wound down like a clock spring toward the strange, bird-filled calm of that second afternoon of my retirement, when all the boys had left and I was alone, once again in the eerie quiet of summer. I own few things besides my files and books. I packed them, and the next day the groundsman drove me into Woodmere. There I found lodging in a splendid Victorian room house run by a descendant of Nat Turner, who joked, when I told her that I was a newly retired teacher, about how the house had always welcomed escaped slaves. I was surprised at how heartily I laughed at this, which had the benefit of putting me instantly on good terms with the landlady. We negotiated a monthly rent, and I went upstairs to set about charting a new life for myself. I was 68 years old. Yes, perhaps too old to be headmaster, but I could still walk 3 miles before dinner, and did so the first afternoon of my freedom. However, by evening my spirits had taken a beating. Fortunately, there was the event to prepare for, as I fear that without it those first days and nights would have been unbearable. I pored again and again over my old notes, extracting devilish questions from the material. But this only occupied a few hours of the day, and by late morning my eyes would grow weary. Objectively speaking, the start of that summer should have been no different from the start of any other, yet it was. Passing my reflection in the hallway mirror on my way down to dinner, I would think to myself, "Is that you?" And on the way back up to my room, "What now?" I wrote letters to my brothers and sister and to several of my former boys. The days crawled by. I reintroduced myself to the town librarian. I made the acquaintance of a retired railroad man who liked as much as I did to sit in the grand screened porch of that house. I took the bus into Washington a few times to spend the day in museums. But as the summer progressed, a certain dread began to form in my mind, which I tried, through the diligence of walking, museum-going, and reading, to ignore. That is, I began to fear that Sedgwick Bell had forgotten about the event. The thought would occur to me in the midst of the long path along the outskirts of town, and as I reached the Passamic, took my break, and then started back again toward home. I would battle with my urge to contact the man. Several times I went to the telephone downstairs in the rooming house, and twice I wrote out letters that I did not send. Why would he go through all the trouble just to mock me, I thought. But then I would recall the circumstances of his tenure at St. Benedict's, and a darker gloom would descend upon me. I began to have second thoughts about events that had occurred half a century before. Should I have confronted him in the midst of the original contest? Should I never even have leapfrogged another boy to get him there? Should I have spoken up to the senator? In early July, however, Sedgwick Bell's secretary finally did call, and I felt that I had been given a reprieve. She apologized for her tardiness, asked me more questions about my taste in food and lodging, and then informed me of the date, 3 weeks later, when a car would call to take me to the airport in Williamsburg. An East America jet would fly me from there to Charlotte, from whence I was to be picked up by helicopter. Helicopter! Less than a month later, I stood before the craft, which was painted head to tail in East America's green and gold insignia, polished to a shine, with a 6-man passenger bay and red, white, and blue sponsons over the wheels. One does not remain at St. Benedict's for 5 decades without gaining a certain familiarity with privilege. Yet, as it lifted me off the pad in Charlotte, hovered for a moment, then lowered its nose and turned eastward over the gentle hills, and then the chopping slate of the sea channel, I felt a headiness that I had never known before. It was what Augustus Caesar must have felt like millennia ago, carried head high on a litter past the Tiber. I clutched my notes to my chest. Indeed, I wondered what my life might have been like if I had felt this just once in my youth. The rotors buzzed like a swarm of bees above us. On the island, I was shown to a suite of rooms in a high corner of the lodge, with windows and balconies overlooking the sea. For a conference on the future of childhood education, or the plight of America's elderly, of course, you could not get 1/10 of these men to attend. But for a privileged romp on a private island, it had merely been a matter of making the arrangements. I stood at the window of my room and watched the helicopter ferry back and forth across the channel, disgorging on the island a who's who of America's largest corporations, universities, and organs of policy. Oh, but what it was to see the boys! After a time, I had made my way back out to the airstrip, and whenever the craft touched down on the landing platform, and one or another of my old students ducked out, clutching his suit lapel as he ran clear of the snapping rotors, I was struck anew with how great a privilege my profession had been. That evening, all of us ate together in the lodge, and the boys toasted me, and took turns coming to my table, where several times one or another of them had to remind me to continue eating my food. Sedgwick Bell ambled over, and with a charming air of modesty showed me the flashcards of Roman history that he'd been keeping in his desk at East America. Then, shedding his modesty, he went to the podium and produced a long and raucous toast, referring to any number of pranks and misdeeds at St. Benedict's that I had never even heard of, but that the chorus of boys greeted with stamps and whistles. At 8:45 they all dropped their forks onto the floor, and I fear that tears came to my eyes. The most poignant of all, however, was how plainly the faces of the men still showed the eager expressiveness of the first-form boys of 41 years ago. Martin Blythe had lost half his leg as an officer in Korea, and now among his classmates he tried to hide his lurching stride, but he wore the same knitted brow that he used to wear in my classroom. Deepak Mehta, who had become a professor of Asian history, walked with a slight stoop, yet he still turned his eyes downward when spoken to. Fred Masudi seemed to have fared physically better than his mates, bouncing about in the Italian suit and alligator shoes of the advertising industry, yet he was still drawn immediately to the other do-nothings from his class. But, of course, it was Sedgwick Bell who commanded everyone's attention. He had grown stout across the middle and bald over the crown of his head, and I saw in his ear, although it was artfully concealed, the flesh-colored bulb of a hearing aid. Yet he walked among the men like a prophet. Their faces grew animated when he approached, and at the tables I could see them competing for his attention. He patted one on the back, whispered in the ear of another, gripped hands and grasped shoulders, and kissed the wives on the lips. His walk was firm and imbued not with the seriousness of his post, it seemed to me, but with the ease of it, so that his stride among the tables was jocular. He was the host, and clearly in his element. His laugh was voluble. I went to sleep early that evening so that the boys could enjoy themselves downstairs in the saloon, and as I lay in bed I listened to their songs and revelry. It had not escaped my attention, of course, that they no doubt spent some time mocking me, but this is what one grows to expect in my post, and indeed it was part of the reason I left them alone. Although I was tempted to walk down and listen from outside the theater, I did not. The next day was spent walking the island's serpentine spread of coves and beaches, playing tennis on the grass court, and paddling in wooden boats on the small inland lake behind the lodge. How quickly one grows accustomed to luxury! Men and women lounged on the decks and beaches and patios, sunning like seals, gorging themselves on the largesse of their host. As for me, I barely had a moment to myself, for the boys took turns at my entertainment. I walked with Deepak Mehta along the beach and succeeded in getting him to tell me the tale of his rise through academia to a post at Columbia University. Evidently, his career had taken a toll, for although he looked healthy enough, he told me that he had recently had a small heart attack. It was not the type of thing one talked about with a student, however, so I let his revelation pass without comment. Later, Fred Masudi brought me onto the tennis court and tried to teach me to hit a ball, an activity that drew a crowd of boisterous guests to the stands. They roared at Fred's theatrical antics and cheered and stomped their feet whenever I sent one back across the net. In the afternoon, Martin Blythe took me out in a rowboat. St. Benedict's, of course, has always had a more profound effect than most schools on the lives of its students. Yet nonetheless, it was strange that once in the center of the pond, where he had rowed us with his lurching stroke, Martin Blythe set down the oars in their locks and told me he had something he'd always meant to ask me. "Yes," I said. He brushed back his hair with his hand. "I was supposed to be the one up there with Deepak and Fred, wasn't I, sir?" "Don't tell me you're still thinking about that." "It's just that I've sometimes wondered what happened." "Yes, you should have been," I said. Oh, how little we understand of men if we think that their childhood slights are forgotten. He smiled. He did not press the subject further, and while I myself debated the merits of explaining why I had passed him over for Sedgwick Bell 41 years before, he pivoted the boat around and brought us back to shore. The confirmation of his suspicions was enough to satisfy him, it seemed, so I said nothing more. He had been an Air Force major in our country's endeavors on the Korean peninsula, yet as he pulled the boat onto the beach, I had the clear feeling of having saved him from some torment. Indeed, that evening when the guests had gathered in the lodge's small theater, and Deepak Mehta, Fred Masudi, and Sedgwick Bell had taken their seats for the reenactment of Mr. Julius Caesar, I noticed an ease in Martin Blythe's face that I believe I had never seen in it before. His brow was not knit, and he had crossed his legs so that above one sock we could clearly see the painted wooden calf. It was then that I noticed that the boys who had paid the most attention to me that day were in fact the ones sitting before me on the stage. How dreadful a thought this was, that they had indulged me to gain advantage. But I put it from my mind and stepped to the microphone. I had spent the late afternoon reviewing my notes, and the first rounds of questions were called from memory. The crowd did not fail to notice the feat. There were whistles and stomps when I named 15 of the first 16 emperors, in order, and asked Fred Masudi to produce the one I had left out. There was applause when I spoke Caesar's words, Ilia jacta alia est, and then, continuing in carefully pronounced Latin, asked Sedgwick Bell to recall the circumstances of their utterance. He had told me that afternoon of the months he had spent preparing, and as I was asking the question, he smiled. The boys had not worn togas, of course, although I personally feel they might have. Yet the situation was familiar enough that I felt a rush of unease as Sedgwick Bell's smile then waned, and he hesitated several moments before answering. But this time, 41 years later, he looked straight out into the audience and spoke his answers with the air of a scholar. It was not long before Fred Masudi had dropped out, of course, but then, as it had before, the contest proceeded neck and neck between Sedgwick Bell and Deepak Mehta. I asked Sedgwick Bell about Caesar's battles at Pharsalus and Thapsus, about the shift of power to Constantinople, and about the war between the patricians and the plebeians. I asked Deepak Mehta about the Punic Wars, the conquest of Italy, and the fall of the Republic. Deepak, of course, had an advantage, for certainly he had studied this material at university. But I must say that the straightforward determination of Sedgwick Bell had begun to win my heart. I recalled the bashful manner in which he had shown me his flashcards at dinner the night before, and as I stood now before the microphone, I seemed to be in the throes of an affection for him that had long been under wraps. "What year were the Romans routed at Lake Trasimene?" I asked him. He paused. 217 B.C., I believe. "Which general later became Scipio Africanus Major?" "Publius Cornelius Scipio, sir," Deepak Mehta answered softly. It does not happen, as often as one might think, that an unintelligent boy becomes an intelligent man. For in my own experience, the love of thought is rooted in an age long before adolescence. Yet Sedgwick Bell now seemed to have done just that. His answers were spoken with the composed demeanor of a scholar. There is no one I like more, of course, than the man who is moved by the mere fact of history. And as I contemplated the next question to him, I wondered if I had indeed exaggerated the indolence of his boyhood. Was it true, perhaps, that he had simply not come into his element yet while at St. Benedict's? He peered intently at me from the stage, his elbows on his knees. I decided to ask him a difficult question. "Chairman Bell," I said, "which tribes invaded Rome in 102 B.C.? His eyes went blank, and he curled his shoulders in his suit. Although he was by then one of the most powerful men in America, and although moments before that I had been rejoicing in his discipline, suddenly I saw him on that stage once again as a frightened boy. How powerful is memory! And once again I feared that it was I who had betrayed him. He brought his hand to his head to think. "Take your time, sir," I offered. There were murmurs in the audience. He distractedly touched the side of his head. "Man's character is his fate," says Heraclitus. And at that moment, as he brushed his hand down over his temple, I realized that the flesh-colored device in his ear was not a hearing aid, but a transmitter through which he was receiving the answers to my questions. Nausea rose in me. Of course I had no proof, but was it not exactly what I should have expected? He touched his head once again and appeared to be deep in thought, and I knew it as certainly as if he had shown me. "The Teutons," he said haltingly, "and I'll take a stab here. The Cimbri?" I looked for a long time at him. Did he know at that point what I was thinking? I cannot say, but after I paused as long as I could bear to in front of that crowd, I cleared my throat and granted that he was right. Applause erupted. He shook it off with a wave of his hand. I knew that it was my duty to speak up. I knew it was my duty as a teacher to bring him clear of the moral dereliction in which I myself had been his partner. Yet at the same time I felt myself adrift in the tide of my own vacillation and failure. The boy had somehow got hold of me again. He tried to quiet the applause with a wave of his hand, but this gesture only caused the clapping to increase, and I am afraid to say that it was merely the sound of a throng of boisterous men that finally prevented me from making my stand. Quite suddenly I was aware that this was not the situation I had known at St. Benedict's School. We were guests now of a significant man on his splendid estate, and to expose him would be a serious act indeed. I turned and quieted the crowd. From the chair next to Sedgwick Bell, Deepak Mehta merely looked at me, his eyes dark and resigned. Perhaps he too had just realized, or perhaps, in fact, he had long known. But in any case, I simply asked him the next question. After he answered it, I could do nothing but put another before Sedgwick Bell. Then Deepak again, then Sedgwick, and again to Deepak. And it was only then, on the third round after I had discovered the ploy, that an idea came to me. When I returned to Sedgwick Bell, I asked him, "Who was Shutruk Nahunte?" A few boys in the crowd began to laugh, and when Sedgwick Bell took his time thinking about the answer, more in the audience joined in. Whoever was the mercenary professor talking in his ear, it was clear to me that he would not know the answer to this one, for if he had not gone to St. Benedict's School, he would never have heard of Shutruk Nahunte. And in a few moments, sure enough, I saw Sedgwick Bell begin to grow uncomfortable. He lifted his pant leg and scratched at his sock. The laughter increased, and then I heard the wives, who had obviously never lived in a predatory pack, trying to stifle their husbands. "Come on, Bell!" someone shouted. "Look at the damn door!" Laughter erupted again. How can it be that for a moment my heart bled for him? He too tried to laugh, but only half-heartedly. He shifted in his seat, shook his arms loose in his suit, looked uncomprehendingly out at the snickering crowd, then braced his chin and said, "Well, I guess if Deepak knows the answer to this one, then it's his ballgame." Deepak's response was nearly lost in the boisterous stamps and whistles that followed, for I am sure that every boy but Sedgwick recalled Henry Stimson's tablet above the door of my classroom. Yet what was strange was that I felt disappointment. As Deepak Mehta smiled, spoke the answer, and stood from his chair, I watched confusion and then a flicker of panic cross the face of Sedgwick Bell. He stood haltingly. How clear it was to me then that the corruption in his character had always arisen from fear, and I could not help remembering that as his teacher I had once tried to convince him of his stupidity. I cursed that day. But then in a moment he summoned a smile, called me up to the stage, and crossed theatrically to congratulate the victor. How can I describe the scene that took place next? I suppose I was naive to think that this was the end of the evening, or even the point of it. For after Sedgwick Bell had brought forth a trophy for Deepak Mehta, and then one for me as well, an entirely different cast came across his features. He strode once again to the podium and asked for the attention of the guests. He tapped sharply on the microphone. Then he leaned his head forward, and in a voice that I recognized from long ago on the radio, a voice in whose deft leaps from boom to whisper, I heard the willow tree drawl of his father. He launched into an address about the problems of our country. He had the orator's gift of dropping his volume at the moment when a less gifted man would have raised it. "We have opened our doors to all the world," he said, his voice thundering, then pausing, then plunging nearly to a murmur. "And now the world has stripped us bare." He gestured with his hands. The men in the audience, first laughing, now turned serious. "We have given away too much for too long," he said. "We have handed our fiscal leadership to men who don't care about the taxpayers of our country, and our moral course to those who no longer understand our role in history." Although he gestured to me here, I could not return his gaze. We have abandoned the moral education of our families. Scattered applause drifted up from his classmates, and here, of course, I almost spoke. We have left our country adrift on dangerous seas. Now the applause was more hearty. Then he quieted his voice again, dropped his head as though in supplication, and announced that he was running for the United States Senate. Why was I surprised? I should not have been. For since childhood the boy had stood so near to the mantle of power that its shadow must have been as familiar to him as his boyhood home. Virtue had no place in the palaces he had known. I was ashamed when I realized he had contrived the entire rematch of Mr. Julius Caesar for no reason other than to gather his classmates for donations. Yet still I chastened myself for not realizing his ambition before. In his oratory, in his physical presence, in his conviction, he had always possessed the gifts of a leader, and now he was using them. I should have expected this from the first day he stood in his short pants suit in the doorway of my classroom and silenced my students. He already wielded a potent role in the affairs of our country. He enjoyed the presumption of his family name. He was blindly ignorant of history and therefore did not fear his role in it. Of course, it was exactly the culmination I should long ago have seen. The crowd stood cheering. As soon as the clapping abated, a curtain was lifted behind him and a band struck up Dixie. Waiters appeared at the side doors, a dance platform was unfolded in the orchestra pit, and Sedgwick Bell jumped down from the stage into the crowd of his friends. They clamored around him. He patted shoulders, kissed wives, whispered and laughed and nodded his head. I saw checkbooks come out. The waiters carried champagne on trays at their shoulders, and at the edge of the dance floor the women set down their purses and stepped into the arms of their husbands. When I saw this, I ducked out a side door and returned to the lodge, for the abandon with which the guests were dancing was an unbearable counterpart to the truth I knew. One could imagine my feelings. I heard the din late into the night. Needless to say, I resolved to avoid Sedgwick Bell for the remainder of my stay. How my mind raced that night through humanity's endless history of injustice, depravity, and betrayal! I could not sleep, and several times I rose and went to the windows to listen to the revelry. Standing at the glass, I felt like the spurned sovereign in the castle tower, looking down from his balcony onto the procession of the false potentate. Yet, sure enough, my convictions soon began to wane. No sooner had I resolved to avoid my host than I began to doubt the veracity of my secret knowledge about him. Other thoughts came to me. How, in fact, had I been so sure of what he'd done? What proof had I at all? Amid the distant celebrations of the night, my conclusion began to seem far-fetched, and by the quiet of the morning I was muddled. I did not go to breakfast. As boy after boy stopped by my rooms to wish me well, I assiduously avoided commenting on either Sedgwick Bell's performance or on his announcement for the Senate. On the beach that day I endeavored to walk by myself, for by then I trusted neither my judgment of the incident nor my discretion with the boys. I spent the afternoon alone in a cove across the island. I did not speak to Sedgwick Bell that entire day. I managed to avoid him, in fact, until the next evening, by which time all but a few of the guests had left, when he came to bid farewell as I stood on the tarmac awaiting the helicopter for the mainland. He walked out and motioned for me to stand back from the platform, but I pretended not to hear him and kept my eyes up to the sky. Suddenly the shining craft swooped in from beyond the wave break, churning the channel into a boil, pulled up in a hover, and then touched down on its flag-colored sponsons before us. The wind and noise could have thrown a man to the ground, and Sedgwick Bell seemed to pull at me like a magnet, but I did not retreat. It was he, finally, who ran out to me. He gripped his lapels, ducked his head, and offered me his hand. I took it tentatively, the rotors whipping our jacket sleeves. I had been expecting this moment, and had decided the night before what I was going to say. I leaned toward him. "How long have you been hard of hearing?" I asked. His smile dropped. I cannot imagine what I had become in the mind of that boy. "Very good, Hundert," he said. "Very good. I thought you might have known." My vindication was sweet, although now I see that it meant little. By then I was on the ladder of the helicopter, but he pulled me toward him again and looked darkly into my eyes. "And I see that you have not changed either," he said. Well, had I? As the craft lifted off and turned westward toward the bank of clouds that hid the distant shoreline, I analyzed the situation with some care. The wooden turrets of the lodge grew smaller and then were lost in the trees, and I found it easier to think then, for everything on that island had been imbued with the sheer power of the man. I relaxed a bit in my seat. One could say that in this case I indeed had acted properly, for is it not the glory of our legal system that acquitting a guilty man is less heinous than convicting an innocent one? At the time of the contest, I certainly had no proof of Sedgwick Bell's behavior. Yet back in Woodmere, as I have intimated, I found myself with a great deal of time on my hands, and it was not long before the incident began to replay itself in my mind. Following the wooded trail toward the river, or sitting in the breeze at dusk on the porch, I began to see that a different ending would have better served us all. Conviction had failed me again. I was well aware of the foolish consolation of my thoughts, yet I vividly imagined what I should have done. I heard myself speaking up. I saw my resolute steps to his chair on the stage, then the insidious flesh-colored device in my palm held up to the crowd. I heard him stammering. As if to mock my inaction, however, stories of his electoral effort soon began to appear in the papers. It was a year of spite and rancor in our country's politics, and the race in West Virginia was less a campaign than a brawl between gladiators. The incumbent was as versed in treachery as Sedgwick Bell, and over my morning tea I followed their battles. Sedgwick Bell called him a liar when he speaks and a crook when he acts, and he called Sedgwick Bell worse. A fist fight erupted when their campaigns crossed at an airport. I was revolted by the spectacle, but of course I was also intrigued, and I cannot deny that although I was rooting for the incumbent, a part of me was also cheered at each bit of news chronicling Sedgwick Bell's assault on his lead. Oh, why was this so? Are we all at base creatures without virtue? Is fervor the only thing we follow? Needless to say, that fall had been a difficult one in my life, especially those afternoons when the St. Benedict's bus roared by the guest house in Woodmere, taking the boys to track meets, and perhaps the Senate race was nothing more than a healthy distraction for me. Indeed, I needed distractions. To witness the turning of the leaves and to smell the apples in their barrels without hearing the sound of 100 boys in the fields, after all, was almost more than I could bear. My walks had grown longer, and several times I had crossed the river and ventured to the far end of the marsh, from where in the distance I could make out the blurred figures of St. Benedict's. I knew this was not good for me, and perhaps that is why, in late October of that year, when I read that Sedgwick Bell would be making a campaign stop at a coal miners' union hall near the Virginia border, I decided to go hear him speak. Perhaps by then the boy had become an obsession for me, I will admit this, for I am as aware as anyone that time is but the thinnest bandage for our wounds. But on the other hand, the race had grown quite close, and would have been of natural interest to anyone. Sedgwick Bell had drawn himself up from underdog to challenger. Now it was clear that the election hinged on the votes of labor, and Sedgwick Bell, though he was the son of aristocrats and the chairman of a formidable corporation, began to cast himself as a champion of the working man. From newspaper reports I gleaned that he was helped along by the power of his voice and bearing, and I could easily imagine these men turning to him. I well knew the charisma of the boy. The day arrived, and I packed a lunch and made the trip. As the bus wound west along the river valley, I envisioned the scene ahead and wondered whether Sedgwick Bell would, at this point, care to see me. Certainly I represented some sort of truth to him about himself. Yet at the same time I also seemed to have become a part of the very delusion that he had foisted on those around him. How far my boys would always stride upon the world's stage, yet how dearly I would always hope to change them. The bus arrived early, and I went inside the Union Hall to wait. Shortly before noon, the miners began to come in. I don't know what I had expected, but I was surprised to see them looking as though they had indeed just come out of the mines. They wore hard hats, their faces were stained with dust, and their gloves and tool belts hung on their waists. For some reason, I had worn my St. Benedict's blazer, which I now removed. Reporters began to fill in as well, and by the time the noon whistle blew, the crowd was overflowing from the hall. As the whistle subsided, I heard the thump-thump of his helicopter, and through the door a moment later I saw the twisters of dust as it hovered into view from above. How clever was the man I had known as a boy! The craft had been repainted the colors of military camouflage, but he had left the sponsons the red, white, and blue of their previous incarnation. He jumped from the side door when the craft was still a foot above the ground, entered the hall at a jog, and was greeted with an explosion of applause. His aides lined the stairs to the high platform on which the microphone stood under a banner and a flag, and as he crossed the crowd toward them, the miners jostled to be near him, knocking their knuckles against his hard hat, reaching for his hands and his shoulders, cheering like Romans at a chariot race. I do not need to report on his eloquence, for I have dwelled enough upon it. When he reached the staircase and ascended to the podium, stopping first at the landing to wave, and then at the top to salute the flag above him, jubilation swept among the throng. I knew then that he had succeeded in his efforts, that these miners counted him somehow as their own, so that when he actually spoke and they interrupted him with cheers, it was no more unexpected than the promises he made then to carry their interests with him to the Senate. He was masterful. I found my own arm upraised. Certainly there were 500 men in that hall, but there was only one with a St. Benedict's blazer over his shoulder and no hard hat on his head. So of course I should not have been surprised when, within a few minutes, one of his aides appeared beside me and told me that the candidate had asked for me at the podium. At that moment, I saw Sedgwick Bell's glance pause for a moment on my face. There was a flicker of a smile on his lips, but then he looked away. Is there no battle other than the personal one? Was Sedgwick Bell at that point willing to risk the future of his political ideas for whatever childhood demon I still remained to him? The next time he turned toward me, he gestured down at the floor, and in a moment the aide had pulled my arm and was escorting me toward the platform. The crowd opened as we passed, and the miners in their ignorance and jubilation were reaching to shake my hand. This was indeed a heady feeling. I climbed the steps and stood beside Sedgwick Bell at the smaller microphone. How it was to stand above the mass of men like that! He raised his hand and they cheered. He lowered it, and they fell silent. There is a man here today who has been immeasurably important in my life, he whispered into his microphone. There was applause, and a few of the men whistled. Thank you, I said into my own. I could see the blue underbrims of 500 hard hats turned up toward me. My heart was nearly bursting. My history teacher, he said, as the crowd began to cheer again. Flashbulbs popped, and I moved instinctively toward the front of the platform. Mr. Hundet, he boomed, from 45 years ago at Richmond Central High School. It took me a moment to realize what he had said. By then he too was clapping, and at the same time lowering his head in what must have appeared to the men below to be respect for me. The blood engorged in my veins. Just a minute, I said, stepping back to my own microphone. I taught you at St. Benedict's School in Woodmere, Virginia. Here is the blazer. Of course, it makes no difference in the course of history that as I tried to hold up the coat, Sedgwick Bell moved swiftly across the podium, took it from my grip, and raised my arm high in his own, and that this pose, of all things, sent the miners into jubilation. It makes no difference that by the time I spoke, he had gestured with his hand, so that one of his aides had already shut off my microphone. For one does not alter history without conviction. It is enough to know that I did speak, and certainly a consolation that Sedgwick Bell realized, finally, that I would. He won that election, not in small part because he managed to convince those miners that he was one of them. They were ignorant people, and I cannot blame them for taking to the shrewdly populist rhetoric of the man. I saved the picture that appeared the following morning in the Gazette. Senator Bell, radiating all the populist magnetism of his father, holding high the arm of an old man who has on his face the remnants of a proud and foolish smile. I still live in Woodmere, and I have found a route that I take now and then to a single high hill from which I can see the St. Benedict's steeple across the Passamic. I take 2 walks every day and have grown used to this life. I have even come to like it. I am reading of the ancient Japanese civilizations now, which I had somehow neglected before, and every so often one of my boys visits me. One afternoon recently, Deepak Mehta did so, and we shared some brandy. This was in the fall of last year. He was still the quiet boy he had always been, and not long after he had taken a seat on my couch, I had to turn on the television to ease for him the burden of conversation. As it happened, the Senate Judiciary Committee was holding its famous hearings then, and the 2 of us sat there watching, nodding our heads or chuckling whenever the camera showed Sedgwick Bell sitting alongside the chairman. I had poured the brandy liberally, and whenever Sedgwick Bell leaned into the microphone and asked a question of the witness, Deepak would mimic his affected southern drawl. Naturally, I could not exactly encourage this behavior, but I did nothing to stop it. When he finished his drink, I poured him another. This, of course, is perhaps the greatest pleasure of a teacher's life, to have a drink one day with a man he has known as a boy. Nonetheless, I only wish we could have talked more than we actually did, but I am afraid there must always be a reticence between a teacher and his student. Deepak had had another small heart attack, he told me, but I felt it would have been improper of me to inquire more. I tried to bring myself to broach the subject of Sedgwick Bell's history, but here again I was aware that a teacher does not discuss one boy with another. Certainly, Deepak must have known about Sedgwick Bell as well, but probably because of his own set of St. Benedict's morals, he did not bring it up with me. We watched Sedgwick Bell question the witness and then whisper into the ear of the chairman. Neither of us was surprised at his ascendance, I believe, because both of us were students of history. Yet we did not discuss this either. Still, I wanted desperately for him to ask me something more, and perhaps this was why I kept refilling his glass. I wanted him to ask, "How is it to be alone, sir, at this age?" Or perhaps say, "You have made a difference in my life, Mr. Hundert." But of course, these were not things Deepak Mehta would ever say. A man's character is his character. Nonetheless, it was startling every now and then, when I looked over at the sunlight falling across his bowed head, to see that Deepak Mehta, the quietest of my boys, was now an old man.